used to know you're honest. You used to know I'm true. I used to know you wooed me and stay to see me through. Looking out and finding the fire. See the world the way I see it now. All alone and I was calling light. Hoping I was angry, hoping I was wrong. You wrote, my eyes, looking out the fire. Hey, hey, calling all your friends in the fire. Dream by the way I see it now. Hoping that something gotta change. Can't expect the world to be rearranged. Fire, 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 oh, fire, 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 oh, fire.
Hey, good morning, Calvary Chapel Plantation family. Welcome to just some time that we have been spending every weekend after Sunday service to discuss, to talk about, to share kind of what God spoke to us personally from Pastor Doug's message this weekend. There's a lot of times I'll say things like, hey, how's everyone doing this morning? And I'm sure you're sitting probably at home or at a kitchen table or somewhere, and you don't even answer me back. I want to remind you that this is a time for response. This is almost a conversation, a back and forth between me and all of you. So I do want to know not just how you're doing, but who's watching. So let us know right now in the chat section who you are, where you're watching from, and how you're doing this morning. How's your week been? Let us know the ups and the downs. Maybe you actually really need prayer this morning. Hey, please pray for me. We love the fact that through technology, we can actually pray for each other and with each other. So let us know right now how you're doing this morning. There's always those emojis at the bottom. You can hit those if you're a person of few words and maybe you'd rather describe how you feel in pictures. That is a great time to do that. But again, we are continuing looking at the book of Genesis. And today we kind of are shifting the person in the family from, we started with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and last week we began to look at Joseph, Jacob's son. And he was the favored son, kind of spoiled, and there was this rift between him and his brothers. But really, the story began to focus on this dream that God gave him, this amazing dream that there would be a time in his life when he would be in a position of authority, and that even his family members would, in a sense, bow down and follow him. Now, as a young guy, kind of cocky, probably shared that dream with his family members a little bit too soon. They, not understanding the dream, looked at him and they're basically saying, are you serious? Like, we're going to serve you? And so now you already have this group of brothers who are looking at him as the favorite son, and there's already that envy and jealousy there. Now there's this dream that comes about. And at the end of last week, we saw the fact that suddenly he comes to see his brothers to check on them, and they say, oh, here comes the dreamer. Let's take care of him. So they beat him up, throw him in a pit. The heart was to murder him, but the plan kind of changes. They end up selling him into slavery, and he finds himself in Egypt. Now, for Joseph, this young man, he's probably thinking in just that moment, man, is the dream over? I mean, it never even really got started. But it's interesting to see the perseverance in the heart of this young man, the faith to never doubt God's plan in all of it, and to honor God wherever he finds himself. And we heard Pastor Doug say, just like Daniel, here's this young man, Joseph, and he finds himself in this foreign land surrounded by different ways. No one's honoring God the way that he had been raised to honor God. But even in all of that, the Bible tells us that God was with Joseph. And Joseph continues to honor God with everything that he has and everything that he is. And he begins to work for this guy named Potiphar, and he's serving not just Potiphar, but he's serving God in the same breath. In the work that he does, he works hard, God sees him working hard, and God blesses the work of his hands, and he begins to give him success. And Potiphar, he's kind of looking on at Joseph, and he knows that he's an Israelite and that he worships this God Jehovah. Like, there's a knowledge there, but we don't ever see Joseph kind of pull Potiphar aside and say, hey, let me tell you about the God that I serve. He probably never had that opportunity. But what he did have the opportunity to do was to work hard. And when he worked hard, God blessed his work. And the Bible tells us that Potiphar didn't just notice the fact that this was a successful young man. Potiphar noticed that the hand of God was on him. And Joseph's work became a testimony to who God was to someone else who didn't believe in him. And that's very important, and I don't want us to skip over that because I think sometimes as Christians we separate the sacred from the secular. I mean, for us, sacred is Sunday mornings when we go to church or we're watching it online. Sacred is our Bibles. Sacred is prayer time. But honestly and truly, for us as followers of Jesus, there is nothing anymore that is secular. Every single part of our lives becomes something sacred because God has called us to now take everything that we do and do it as unto him. It's Colossians 3:23. Mark it down, memorize it. It's something that you should always be motivated by. In Colossians 3:23, it says, whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord and not to man. You know, so often we fall in the trap of focusing on the people that God has placed around us and trying to be motivated to serve them solely by looking at them. But that's not what Joseph did. Joseph was serving Potiphar, but more importantly, he was serving God. And so I want to ask you guys a question this morning. You know, I know that for most of us, we don't work at a church. Most of you probably work out in the world, and most of you probably work for someone that's not even a believer. Have you been doing what you do as unto the Lord or as unto man? And maybe there's an area of your life where you're like, you know what? It's an area that I probably haven't given much attention to. Maybe it's a mundane activity that doesn't just happen in your work week. Maybe it's at your home, but God is like kind of convicting you. Hey, would you begin to do that as unto me and not as unto man? I can tell you something that happened in my life a couple of weeks ago. I love cleaning, I love order, and I was sitting there and I found myself in front of the sink in the kitchen, a little bit frustrated because the dishes had piled up, and as much as I love to finish that task and see it completed, I was frustrated. But as I was sitting there washing those dishes, honestly, I'm not making this story up, this verse came to my mind, and God is like, well, would you wash these dishes as unto me? And I'm like, God, that's silly. I mean, it's washing dishes. He's like, no, don't forget what I said. Whatever you do. And in that moment, there was this exchange, there was this recognition of God's presence there with me. And my experience of washing dishes became one of joy because I'm like, Lord, I'm going to do this as unto you. I'm going to do this with all my might. I'm going to do this well because I'm not doing it for my wife or my kids, though it blesses them. I'm doing it for you. So right now in the chat section, what is one area of your life that God is calling you to begin to do something as unto him and not unto man? It could be the work that you do. It could be a task there. It could be you as a student and how hard you study. It could be the wife or the husband that you are. It could be the son or daughter that you are. And maybe there's a specific task or a way in which you're doing it that God is saying, I want you to do this as unto me. And so what is that for you? Maybe it is. Maybe it's house cleaning. Maybe you're like, you know what? I get so frustrated and aggravated when I have to clean up after someone. You're frustrated because you're doing it as unto them and not as unto God. Put something in the chat right now. Like, you know what? I think this is an area where God is calling me to do this as unto him. Well, the story begins to continue, and here is Joseph, and now he's got this favor upon him, and now Potiphar has given him a promotion in the sense. He's over everything that's happening in his house. And we saw today how with new levels comes new devils and new temptations. And the temptations that come can be sometimes very overt or sometimes very covert. And I love the one that Pastor Doug mentioned, these things that we tell ourselves, oh, I can handle this. And we come face to face with temptations in our lives, and we've walked with the Lord for a certain amount of time, and we've said no to a certain temptation for a season, and now we feel like we're strong enough to face those temptations head on. And Joseph begins to be tempted now by Potiphar's wife, probably a beautiful woman. And she begins to say to him day after day, it's not just one day, day after day, she's looking at him longingly and saying, lie with me. But day after day, somehow, some way, Joseph says no. And he came face to face with not just the temptation, but probably some of those lies that his heart would even tell him, hey, you can handle this. The Bible tells us he wouldn't even talk to her about it. He didn't even want to be alone with her because he knew how deceitful his heart was and how strong temptation can be. And so when you see this question, oh, I can handle this, this is something that our heart will tell us all the time. And Pastor Doug mentioned 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, but the verse before that I think is so important in verse 12. It says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Is there an area in your life right now where once you were tempted to do something and you've had a really good stretch of being able to abstain from that, and maybe today you're like, no, I can handle that now. No, I can be around people that are drinking or smoking or doing all these things. I'm not tempted to do that anymore, and yet God's like, hey, be careful. Let him who thinks he stands take heed. Be careful lest you fall. It's easy to fall into the temptation of thinking, oh, I can handle this. Oh, I'm strong enough now. Oh, I don't need anyone's help. Now, the Bible is very clear. Take heed. And then the next verse, so important. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. That with every temptation, God's always going to give us a way out. The question is always, will you take it? Remember that. The question is always going to be, will you take the way out? And the question is not, is God going to give you a way out? He is faithful to provide that. And time and time and time again, Joseph comes face to face with temptation, and he says no. And this is a question, I think, of willpower versus heart power. And again, it's important, the boundaries, to not be alone with her. He wouldn't even talk to her about it. And he's got these guardrails set up. And some of you may think, man, guardrails are for weak people. I don't need those things anymore. I don't need accountability in my life. I don't need blockers on my internet. Whatever it is, you look at other people that have these guardrails and you may think, oh, they're weak. And they are for weak people. I think what we all need to come to agreement with is the fact that we are all weak people. We never come to a point in our life, we weren't designed that way to be self-sufficient. God didn't make us that way. God made us in such a way where we would be dependent upon him. So the moment that you think in your life that you're strong enough to do it on your own, you've been deceived, you've been fooled, you've been lied to, and you've believed the lie. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, Paul says this. I want to read this to you. And God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. God is looking at Paul and he says, my grace is enough to carry you through, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. You see, the problem, I think, for most of us is we're not experiencing the power and strength of God in our life because we're not willing to admit that we're weak. Paul says, when he said that to me, that his strength is made perfect in my weakness, it changed my perspective on my weaknesses. He says, now I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. Now I'm going to freely admit, hey, I'm weak here because when I do that, my Father has promised to give me strength in that area of my life. It's important that we are willing to admit that we're weak because that's when God will give us strength. You see, admitting that we're weak just brings us to a point of relying upon God. And so that is what I think that Joseph does over and over and over again. And what we need to realize is that as much as we might want to say no to temptation and try to avoid it, temptation is never going to stop coming for you. Pastor Doug referenced Proverbs chapter 7. And in verse 13, speaking of that adulterous woman, it says that she caught the young man. He was trying to avoid her, but she ran after him and caught him. Genesis 4, verses 7, Cain slew Abel. We know that story. And in Genesis 4:7, God said, sin crouches at your door and desires to have you. So temptation's running after us. We have an enemy that's like a lion. How do we say no? It's more than saying no to temptation. You've got to be able to say yes to God. Joseph did both. He said no to the temptation of Potiphar's wife, but he also said yes to God because what he found in God was something better than what the temptation offered. There's a great song by a guy named Pat Baird. It's called Better. And in it, he just describes all of the things in life that try to steal his heart from God, but he says over and over again, your love is better than life. You are the way, the truth, and the life. And he lists beauty and power and money. He says, all of these amazing things that the world offers, Jesus, you are better than. And he's reminding himself over and over because the temptation of life is to pull your heart away from God and say, hey, don't you want this? But he's saying, no, I don't, because Jesus is better. And this is the power of comparison. Sometimes comparison can get you into trouble. It can lead to jealousy and envy. But when it comes to temptation, church, we have to bring ourselves in those moments of looking at whatever, okay, the devil's tempting me with this, but I have this over here in God. He is better. We have to make the comparison. Because eventually, just trying to flex our willpower and always say no, we're going to fail and fall. And so right now in the chat, here's what I would love for you to do. I want you to list some of the ways that Jesus is better. List his attributes. List what he's done for you. List the goodness of God. What are some words that come to your mind when you think of God that draw your heart away from temptation and bring you to a place where you fall more in love with God? Because it's more than willpower, it's heart power. And the more you dwell on the goodness of God and the beauty of Jesus, the greater you'll have the ability to say no to the temptations of this world. So right now, in the chat section, Facebook, YouTube, begin to list off some words. His grace, his goodness. He's my intercessor. He's praying for me. All of the different things who God is to you. Begin to list the beauty of our God because those are the things that will woo us away from temptation. And there's always a way out. I just want to remind you guys that I think some of us feel trapped in maybe a certain way of doing things. We find ourselves with an addiction and we feel like we can't get out. God has promised we will always have a way out. And sometimes, certainly, I mean, what a great story Pastor Doug told about him on that college campus and that girl saying, hey, come study in my dorm room. And he ran. I'm thinking about that story going down and seeing Pastor Doug turn and run. I'm laughing inside, but I'm like, oh, that we would all just do that and not care what we look like and just run away from the temptations that are before us. But again, don't forget, you can't just run away from something. You've got to run to something. And I think Pastor Doug was running into the arms of Jesus, his Savior, who has saved his life and changed him. And that's what we need to do over and over again. And so you would think in the story, here's a young man. He's honored God. And now everything's going to go great, but it doesn't. There's a false accusation from Potiphar's wife. He tried to, in essence, take advantage of me, and now he's thrown into prison. And we do need to be reminded that just because we are honoring God and doing what he calls us to do, it doesn't mean that life's always going to be perfect. And it ends up that now Joseph is in a prison, but this is all part of his dream coming true. God has placed him in a prison with a butler and a baker that will eventually get him to stand before Pharaoh. And so what we see is God using all things together for good. And there's this amazing dream that God has given Joseph, and you might think, oh, it's to be the leader of Egypt and to deliver the nation of Israel, to provide food for them in a time of famine, and certainly it is. But what you see is that more than bringing Joseph to a position or a place, God is trying to make Joseph into a better person. He's making him more like Jesus. He's creating in him this heart for hard work and integrity and purity and fortitude. Like he's making him more like himself through difficult situations in his life. And so as we close, I want us to spend some time talking about just that. I want you to think about and consider, look at your life, because God does have a plan, a dream for all of our lives, but it's more than just rising you up to a place of power. It's making you more like Jesus. So I want you to talk about right now in the chat section about it. Maybe it was a very difficult season, but as you went through it, God has made you more like him. And I want you not just to talk about the situation, like, hey, here's what happened. It was really hard, and I walked through this. Not just the situation, but I want you to talk about how you're different from it. Oh, so I went through this trial. You know, I think about what we went through this year as a family and getting COVID and being sick. But from that, God has made me more of a worshiper. I remember I couldn't really read or even really pray, but when it came to worship music, something just changed about me. And right now in my life, I'm more of a worshiper than I've ever been. And it happened through a really hard time. And I think it was all part of God's dream for me of making me fall more in love with him so that I could become more like him. We've all got a story like that. And so I want you guys to share that story right now in the chat section. I'll walk away for a few minutes, and when I come back, I'll close us in prayer.
When I'm looking at the face of disappointment, I stand before my unparted seas. When my heart has felt the whisper of your promise that I have yet to see. Before I see the miracle before me, before the night has given way to dawn, let my heart be found still singing of your goodness, that you might know my love. Still you are good, my Father. Still you are good, Still you are good, my Father. Still you are good to me. Even if the storm never ceases raging, if the water never turns to wine, I will sing aloud the hope that never fails me. I am yours and you are mine. Still you are good, my Father. Still you are good, Still you are good, my Father. Still
Hey guys, so I'm looking at some of your responses and I see this theme. I see difficult situations in our lives, and through those difficult situations, God is creating in all of us a deeper sense of dependency. So for some of you, it's like, man, when I go through a really hard time, it makes me pray more. I went through a season of sickness. It made me depend more on God. I had a problem in my family, and I just started worshiping him because everything else was falling apart, and the only thing I could set my mind on was him. And I want you to see that because I think this young man, Joseph, really had a firm grasp on that. His life just seemed to get worse and worse and worse. But in all of it, there was this sense of a deepening dependency upon God. God, I know that everything's fallen apart, but I'm still going to honor you with my life. I'm still going to work as unto you. And I'm going to be faced with temptations to sin. And when that happens, it's not just me saying no to a temptation. It's me looking to you and saying, I love you, and I'm weak, and I need your strength right now. And God was using all of those things, not just to get this young man to a palace, but to get him to depend more upon him so that he'd become more like Jesus. And that's what he's doing in all of our lives. So guys, I hope that you maybe walk away from our time today with a different perspective on life, a different perspective on what God's dream is for your life. And you see that in all of it, he's in control. In all of it, he's trying to just turn our attention to him. In all of our weaknesses, he wants to prove himself strong. There's always a way out, and the way out always leads to Jesus. So I'm glad that we serve a God like that. I'm glad that you guys stuck around today and we had this discussion. Let's close our time in prayer. Father, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for your power, but not just your power, your love. It's perfect. And your word tells us that that perfect love casts out fear. So if there's fear in any of my brothers or sisters right now that are going through a difficult season, I pray that you would set their minds on truth, on who you are, on your great and perfect plan for their lives. God, help us with life. Help us with the mundane things, the things that we view as secular. May we begin to do those things as unto you so that we could do it with joy, we could do it with all our heart, and that maybe in the process, someone who doesn't know you would look on at our lives and want to know why, and we could point them to you. Thank you for who you are to us, our strength, our hope, our peace, our God, our Father. You are everything, and you are better than everything. We love you. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you next weekend.